This is Baking Ingredient Function Part 2. So welcome back. The last video we ended on the different types of flour. So we're going to look here at fats and oils very briefly. So fats include butter, margarine, oil, shortening like Crisco. These things keep your baked goods moist, they add flavor, and they also help things stay fresh longer. So if you are buying a baked good that will stay in your cabinet for months on end without being stale, there is quite a bit of fat in there. When it comes to the mixing method, so the mixing methods, how you put the fat together with other ingredients, that's really going to impact the function of the fats. If you thoroughly mix it, that's going to impact the overall texture. You can rub it, you can cream it, you can do it like soft and cake-like. You can also cut it like in the biscuit method, and then you get a more flaky, textured baked good product. So when it comes to fats and oils, they're not always exchangeable. Butter is your most common, then you're going to go with liquid oils. Margarine is acceptable in some baked goods, but not necessarily in all of them. You're not going to get the same product. Sweeteners, when we talk about sweeteners, we're generally talking about refined sugar, so white sugar. You also have brown sugar, dark brown or light brown. And then there's sugar syrups, honey, molasses, brown sugar, corn syrup, honey, malt syrup. These things are also not always interchangeable, but you can add them in. If you were to make a cookie with all honey and no white sugar, that's really going to change your final baked good product. But it would sweeten the product. They add flavor. They also add color. When sugars cook and they caramelize, they turn brown. And so that process there is really going to add a lot of flavor and color to your baked goods. You can cream them together. You can add them with the fat and cream them beforehand, or you can add them in with the dry ingredients. They're going to make your product soft and tender. So artificial sweeteners and sugar substitutes, these do not caramelize, and so your product is not going to be very brown when you utilize those. Leaveners. A leavener makes things puff, and so a leavener is going to make something rise. That's the difference between like bread or a cracker. These are need to be measured very carefully because leavener really plays a big impact on your baked good, and a little bit too much can go a long way. There are 3 different categories of leaveners. You have chemical, baking soda, baking powder, like are used in quick breads or muffins or cookies or cakes. Essentially, with a chemical leavener, you can mix your batter or dough up and put it directly into the oven. Organic is generally yeast, and when it comes to the yeast, it does take a little while before that actually works. So you blend your yeast and your ingredients together, and you give it an hour or two to rise. You can even give it a couple of days before the yeast actually works. There's also physical leavener, so there's a way to make things light and fluffy without actually incorporating yeast or baking soda or baking powder. And typically this involves air. So something like whipping egg whites and folding something in like with a souffle, that would be a good example of a physically leavened product. So air plays a big role, but typically what you're going to run into is baking soda powder or yeast. So when we talk about baking powder is a chemical leavener. It does work right away. It produces a gas in which makes things puff and rise. Baking soda and an acid with an inactive ingredient is what this is comprised of. It does require heat. So when you're going to incorporate baking powder, you do need to have some heat. The difference between baking soda and baking powder involves the fact that the acid is already added to the soda, and you don't actually have to put heat to the process to make it work. Like as soon as it gets wet, it starts to create those gases. So you do want to bake those things immediately that have baking soda in them. Physical leavener, so that's going to be air introduced into your batter, and so the air is going to expand during the baking process. The creaming method, when you cream that fat and sugar together, like when making cakes and cookies, that's going to play a role into how it comes up or down. The foaming method, this is eggs without sugar, so this is when you're like making a meringue and you turn egg whites into a foam. There's whole egg foams, which are utilized in sponge cakes, and then you have egg white foams. So angel food cake, I need to change this here to angel instead of angle food cake, meringue, and then souffle. Yes, I meant angel food cake. And then steam itself. So when you have quite a bit of liquid involved, and when liquid is heated and it turns to steam and it rises, that's going to help that product rise as well. So cream puffs, pie crust, some popovers are a type of bread that's leavened purely utilizing the steam. So it makes things fluffy. Yeast, this is organic. So yeast is a fungus. It is a microscopic organism. It does not make you sick. It does ferment. And by fermenting, what that means is that the yeast eats the carbohydrates or sugars out of your product, and it releases carbon dioxide through the byproduct. So this does take a little bit longer. Yeast is typically combined with gluten. So you want to actually knead and work a product that's going to have yeast in it. When you're making yeast bread or pizza crust or something like that, then you do typically knead and work your product. By developing that gluten, the gluten creates strength in the dough, and that strength holds the gas bubbles for the yeast for a long period of time, and you get a better, stronger product. So about any time that you are using yeast as a leavener, then you definitely also want to work your dough. So you're going to knead it. Fold it, punch it, fold it, punch it, fold it, punch it. You can do that mechanically or with your hands. Thickeners are also used as a baker's ingredient. So gelatin, flour, arrowroot, cornstarch, eggs themselves are thickeners. So thickeners are going to be the difference between, say, pudding or pie filling versus like chocolate milk. So if you pour just straight chocolate milk into a pie crust, it's never going to get thick. But if you incorporated egg yolks or cornstarch or gelatin, some sort of thickener into the product in the correct manner, then you would end up with a more solid product that you could actually cut and create like a slice out of. Like I always tell my gelatin, that's the difference between Kool-Aid and Jell-O. You also have flavoring agents, so cocoa, spices, salts, nuts, extracts. These impact the taste, they impact the color. Some commonly used spices in baking: cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, cloves, not gloves, cloves, ginger, caraway, cardamom, allspice, anise, poppy seed. Um, when you change spices, you just change the flavor. So for once you get to know some things, I don't like pumpkin spice. Like I'm not a big fan of something flavored with pumpkin spice. And I've realized over the years that the cloves and the mace and maybe the nutmeg have to do with it. I like cinnamon, I like vanilla, but I really don't like cloves. I think that when things have pumpkin spice in them, they taste like a Yankee candle that's been melted down, which is kind of gross to me. So I've learned that I can make, say, a pumpkin cheesecake or something that maybe that asks for allspice or asks for these, and leave it out and not change the overall product. So if I make a pumpkin pie and I don't put cloves in it, then just the flavor is changed. Your overall texture is not. Salt is more than just making something taste salty. So salt enhances the flavor of other food items. It also controls yeast fermentation. If something doesn't have salt added to it that needs to have even a little bit of salt added to it, it's going to be flat. And salt can very greatly impact the overall flavor. You're not just trying to make something taste salty. Like you really need salt to make something right. And that's a hard thing sometimes for me to get through to my students. You also have things like vanilla bean or lemon or almond. It's really important because extracts are usually very strong that you use them wisely. And then last but not least are the liquids. So liquids are extremely important. Most of the time, these are a little interchangeable. Water and milk are your most common. Cream is also common, which is just a heavier fat dairy product. Molasses, honey, vegetable oils, butter. These things all provide moisture, and they also help gluten to develop, either if you want it or not. So water is the most common and basic. Milk does add a little bit more texture, flavor, and nutritional value. And then that is all of your baker's ingredients there. So when you look at the categories of very common baker's ingredients, ultimately every baked good is comprised of pretty much just these ingredients, and how you mix them, how you measure them, that's going to make the difference of whether or not you end up with a cookie or a brownie or bread or a cake.